Hi, I'm Trish Stuart. I'd like to welcome you to my little video here. I want to show you some pressing techniques to make your quilting a little bit more successful. Okay, first I want to explain something. Everybody has a different way of doing something. If this isn't working for you, then there's probably another way to do it. And the quilt police are not going to come and arrest you if you don't do this right. What I want to show you is the way that works for me. And so right now we're going to start out doing strip piece bands. This would be for something that you're doing when you're creating quilts that you either sew a bunch of strips together into a wide band and then you subcut them, or you just sew two together to make like a checkerboard border, regardless of how many strips are sewn together. I use this technique, and let's start right now. I'll show you this. Okay, this is kind of a long view of my ironing board. You can see the first thing you have to worry about is your tension when you're sewing your strips together. This one, my tension on my machine was too tight, and look at how it bows. So you can correct this by just kind of pulling it to get your seam to release. You know, you end up with some on the end that ends up being undone because unless you leave a long tail. So you can do that, but sometimes you can't if your tension is way too tight, and then you end up having to rip it out. But you can see now I've got two. This one my tension was correct. This one it's not. Now they're fine. First thing you're going to do is set your seams, and that means you take your hot iron and you just run it down the seam, and it pushes the seam into the fabric so it's nice and flat. Let me do both of these, but I'm only going to show you how to press one. Obviously, we don't need to press two. I'm going to put my darkest fabric on the top. So here we go. And then I'm going to, I've set the seam, I'm going to pick up the edge, I'm going to let the weight of my iron push it over. And the reason I do that is I don't want to have any little pleat. I want this to be pressed as far open as it can go. So here we go. I press it to one side. Now I'm going to turn on my steam, and I'm going to run the iron up, and I'm going to continue pushing with the grain. I don't want to go okay. If I'm doing a lot, then when I open it, I wiggle as I come down the seam, and it helps keep it from making little jiggy-jaggy bows in it. And there, that's it. Now, if I want this seam to be pressed open, I'm going to turn it over now. I've already pressed the seam to one side. There's no little pleat, so that means the fabric isn't pushed over like this. And then I'm going to nudge this to start, and now is when I'm really going to wiggle. Just little wiggles all the way down the iron, the band as I iron this. Some people do not like to use steam. I use steam because I find that it holds it and keeps the seam nice and crisp and flat. And I turn it off, and I press again to make sure that there's no moisture in there. That's it. Now you're ready to do your sub-cutting. Let me just give you one more tip. When you're cutting, and you want to cut squares, instead of cutting, like cutting the end, and then cutting 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches, and measuring from the top or the bottom to make this straight, put your guide on your seam so that when you're measuring, so say my guide right here is going to be my 1/2 inch mark. My 1/2 inch mark is lined up right on the seam. That way, when I cut it and I sew it together, any discrepancy is in the seam allowance, but my seams, which is what you're going to see on the front of your quilt, those are all perfectly square. I hope that helps. now that you know how to press your bands in your half square triangles and quarter square triangles, if you don't know the sizes to cut your squares to create these different half square triangle units or quarter square triangle units, then you can go to my website. There's a PDF that you can download that gives you that information. Just go to the Tips and Techniques page.